We're on the Gapminder site. This is a quick follow-up on some in-class demonstrations I've done. And periodically what I'll do is I'll follow up, or I will introduce a classroom tool using brief videos. And I try to keep them brief, even though I have a tendency to sort of extend my thoughts. Still, what we're looking at here is we're looking at the graph of life expectancy in years plotted against income per person, which is shown in terms of GDP per capita in dollars per year, adjusted for inflation and prices. And that dollars per year adjusted for inflation and prices is what's called a purchasing power parity, or a PPP adjustment. And by adjusting for inflation, it means that if we do see real growth in GDP per capita, we're looking at growth that's due to additional value of goods and services, even though that's been adjusted for any price inflation that's happened. Now, we've looked at and we've talked about the nature of relationships that we can see in these two variable graphs. And we've also done some animation looking at this. What I wanted to show you in this video is I wanted to reinforce on the idea that you could plot a particular variable over time instead of plotting one variable against another. And that's kind of useful if all you want is a graph of some indicator. And that's pretty easy to do. And so I'm actually going to do that, as I did in class, by clicking on the variable label here and just choosing time. Boom. Now what happens there is we're now looking at a horizontal axis of time and a stack of all of the countries and territories that the program is covering. And what we did in class, if I move this down just a little bit, oops, I don't need to move it down that much. If I scroll down and I pick our favorite, Botswana, and then if you look here, you'll see that this is a transparency adjuster for all of the dots except the one you have selected. And so if we move it to transparent, we can see that Botswana shows on its own. And then if we click from about 1909, just some random number, there's that dip we saw. We can see that life expectancy then starts to show up and graph and move up and to the right. There's the dip down, and there's the sort of get back, not to where they were, but towards where they were. Now, there are a number of things we can adjust on this, but I'm not going to focus on those adjustments for now. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch our screen to child mortality, and what's going to happen is that Gapminder is going to keep the same rendering, and so this is child mortality plotted for Botswana over time, right? And so you can see that child mortality went from 300 and something and then gradually decreased until today the child mortality is 53.3. And what I wanted to point out here is that we can adjust the axes, and I want to do this in a couple of ways. So first of all, let's notice that the axis for child mortality that Gapminder has chosen is one that is logarithmic, right? And so we can see here that the gap here is 2.5, the gap here is 5, the gap here is 10, the gap here is 20, 40, 80, 160. And so you can see that even though the spatial gap is small, the quantitative gap is large. And if we switch that, just like we did in class, to a linear axis, then we click back in the graph, you can see that now we have a linear axis. And this particular graph is showing where the maximum value, which is in 1909 and is 391, is really only halfway through the graph. And so we've got all this empty real estate. And we talked very briefly in class about how we might change the axes. And one student, whose name I can't remember, suggested that we could drag the axis. It doesn't work in this interface, but we do have an ability to change the axis by clicking on Options and choosing X and Y, and then adjusting the axis. And so we can see the minimum here is 1.9, and that's perfectly fine. But let's make the maximum, let's make it 500. And now let's say OK. And that means that more of the real estate of the graph is now being used for the graph itself. Now we have to be a bit careful here. Because once you start changing the axis for one country, that might not work for some other country in a way that allows you to compare the gradients and pathways. So you have to be a little bit careful here. Also notice that here, the left half of the graph is empty. And so we could do exactly the same thing. Click on Options. It's going to hold the axis that we have. And let's make the graph, I don't know, let's make it 1875. And let's say OK. And now we have a graph that actually kind of sort of makes sense in terms of the classic way that you would create a graph. And I hope that makes perfect sense to everyone. We're in this video is about 7 minutes now. So let's go back to comparing child mortality and income. And here you can see that what we have is the graph that we're familiar with, right? And so we have the graph right here that we're familiar with. There's that bump up in child mortality. And here, because we're only looking at Botswana, do you notice how the right-hand side of the graph is empty? And so you can sort of work on ways to make the graph look like, if you're trying to make a graph for a presentation, you can adjust the axes in ways that work for you. And that's one of the things that the Gapminder added. You didn't used to be able to do that, but they've added it. And there are a number of other, if we click on Options again, and we collapse that, there are a number of other things that you can do. You can zoom, you can increase the text size for a presentation, and that makes the graph much better if you're going to screen grab it or you're going to show it on the screen, as I did. You can also alter the opacity of non-selected, as I said already. You can adjust the speed of the animation. You can also change the color of the dots. Oops, and I've blown it there. But we can alter the color. And those are things that you can explore if you want to figure out how the software can work for you. Here's the risk. If you put on another country, like I was going to put on Australia, and then we run the graph, it's going to run the graph back because I pressed from the beginning. It's going to run the data back And for some reason, Botswana is not showing there, and I'm not sure why. Oh, there it is. I'm sorry. It's there was a data gap, and so you can see here, right, that Botswana ends right there. But look at Australia. It can't show the graph, the end of the graph, because we limited the axis for income. And so we'd have to go on, and we'd have to go back here, and we'd have to go to income. And I am guessing that the GDP per capita for Australia is in the, just guessing, in the 40s. So I'm going to put 50,000 there, and I'm going to click return. Yeah, and so now we have a graph that shows Australia's data all the way out. And you can see that for the most recent data point, the child mortality rate for Botswana is 53, and the child mortality rate for Australia is 3.5. So that's a very significant difference. And before I get into minute 12, let's just switch this back to life expectancy. And the graph will fill in. And you can see here, remember this has income. And so you can see here that the life expectancy for Botswana is 58.7. This is a couple years of a lag. And the life expectancy for Australia is 82.3. And so you can do these pairwise comparisons between countries. And there's a chance that somebody in the class will say, hey, can I update the pairwise comparison data for those child mortality comparisons on the quiz? And I will say, yes, you can. I'll send you the PowerPoint, make a table and get the data from the Gapminder and fill it in for me. I'm only going to do that for one person, so if you're that person, I look forward to getting your submission. Let me know. And let me end the video there, and thanks for watching.